I have twin 4-year-old grandchildren who get very rough with each other, often scratching each other and fighting over their toys. And my question is, what sort of consequences would be appropriate for their ages and their behavior? Now, they're 4-year-olds. Well, in order to answer that question, or I should even say prior to answering that question, there's a more important question or topic that precedes that, and that is the why these children are scratching each other and fighting over their toys. That's more important to address that than how to punish them or what type of consequences to give them, though that obviously has to be addressed too, because, even in the most loving of homes, children are going to act up from time to time. Now, I'd like to address the more important part first. If you have children who are getting very rough with each other, scratching, biting, kicking, hitting, fighting over toys, hitting each other with toys, throwing them, breaking them, all these sorts of things that fall into that milieu, you have a rather important issue at hand. A couple of principles to remember, and in order of importance. First and foremost, children in a household, much of the time, if not most of the time, they act out the issues that are going on in the house, particularly repressed and or unaddressed emotions, emotional distortion that's going on in the home. So I work with a lot of families and a lot of children, and what I've seen in almost 100% of the cases, I'll allow for the possible exception, but it's pretty much been 100% of the cases, when I see children who are very wild and violent like this, almost unequivocally, there is a great deal of anger in that household that is either being mimicked, because children do act as parrots, or is being filtered through them if it's very repressed and or unaddressed, and it will emerge through the children. So before you jump into what kind of consequences do I give them, if you're asking me what size cup to use to bail the boat, I'd like to direct your attention to finding the hole in the boat. It's more important to plug the hole so your boat doesn't sink, rather than equipping people with the right cups to bail. So I strongly, strongly recommend that you look and see in who are the adult figures living in or frequenting that household, particularly living in, and see what types of emotional issues are not being handled and or addressed within them. It's rather unfair that children often bear the brunt of the parents and or grandparents' lack of accountability and lack of self-discipline and self-correction. So that's just an unfortunate situation in life. Now, that having been said, and as you address those things and cleanse them and clear them within yourselves, the adults who rule and guide the home, then you will see the changes in the behavior of the children very, very quickly. Now, along the way, to get to the subject of consequences, I would rather not give a general panacea that may not apply to each house, but I'd rather give you principles that you can apply, that do apply to every house, that then you can tailor into the specifics that you'll then administer to the children. Very important, first of all, when the children are acting up, that you are able to separate or detach your personal mental and emotional reaction and stimulation by their behaviors, that you're able to separate that from your ability as a sentient, wise, kind, loving adult to facilitate and administer a situation. It's really, really important. In other words, in simple terms, don't project back on your children or take out your anger or your emotional reaction on them. And more often than not, in fact, most of the time, this is what most parents do. They see something happen in the house, and then the child re-stimulates their own anger, which ironically was what got the child going in the first place. But now yours is stimulated and it's up and open, and then parents will then take out or transfer their anger onto the children by way of the punishment / consequences they give, oftentimes, more often than not, having the time by far not fit the crime. So it's important to make sure that you, first and foremost, make sure that you are clear, that you're in a kind and loving space and not activated and stimulated. Now, that doesn't mean you can fake it and pretend that you're not, but sometimes it's very appropriate to remove yourself or postpone the giving of consequences until you can get clear, so you know that you're not virtually attacking and abusing your children with your own restimulated anger by way of, that was activated by what they did. Again, there are sometimes emergency situations where you have to intervene in the moment, and that's one of those situations where you'll get better with practice. But hold the intention that I will not put my anger or my reaction on the children, that I will be centered, grounded, clear, detached, and come from a place of wisdom and guidance and unconditional love in applying whatever consequences need be. Number 2 is that, of course, the time fits the crime. And again, if you're not projecting or putting your charged emotions on them, most people with innate intelligence can find their way through that. Oftentimes when there's an over-dramatization of the consequences, there's a charge being put on it, and that's a form of abuse. So again, I'm sticking with some general principles you can apply. This one hopefully goes without saying, but even in this day and age, there are plenty of households who practice the barbaric practice of hitting or beating the children. Under no circumstance should a child ever be struck. Ever, ever, ever. There is no situation that's an exception, ever. So I would strongly recommend you rule that out. Regardless of what your parents said or what you've done in the past, it doesn't work. I don't care what anyone says. It doesn't work. It'll only build resentment and hatred, and it'll create violence. Violence creates violence. And think again of yourself, as Jesus used to say, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. Would you ever want someone hitting you for any reason whatsoever? If you made a mistake, or even if you had an emotional outburst, do you think it warrants being struck? The answer is unequivocally no. You won't find an adult on the planet who says, yes, come hit me if I speak up too loudly, or if I say something off-colored, or if I make a mistake at work, just whack me. No one's going to say that. They say you do, and I'll whack you back. Or we'll see what happens. So that's a really important axiom for your children. Another recommendation I have, I like, and I've used in my household and in my ashrams and in my teachings, I like to give children consequences and suggest to parents, create consequences for your children's non-loving behaviors that will A, illuminate what was inappropriate, B, help them recreate themselves. Sometimes you can give them an action, an activity that is a way of recreating themselves as love. In other words, if you did a certain thing that was destructive, you could give them a consequence that's constructive. Let's say one child breaks his sister's dollhouse. Perhaps he could build a dollhouse or repair the dollhouse. So you're creating a constructive behavior to transmute a destructive behavior. And also consequences that educate. So you have ones that illuminate, educate, recreate. So it's all very positive. And reprogram too. Reprogram things that use positive affirmation. One that I use in the ashrams and with my adult disciples that works equally as well with children is the writing of positive affirmations to transmute negative behaviors and to repattern and reprogram the consciousness, because it's all about programming. A lot of the errant behaviors that people demonstrate stem from corrupt software. If we use the metaphor that like we're a computer, they come from corrupt software which we got from improper training from parents, teachers, peers, siblings, whatever, employers. So we have to reprogram. Now, it is known and has been proven psychologically that when you write something, the imprint, the integration it has on your brain, on your intellect, is the equivalent of reading it 10 times. So when you write things out, it is an accelerated spiritual tool of transformation to write. So I often will give people positive affirmation to write, which transmutes the karma of the action, while at the same time putting in proper software to transmute, transcend, and replace the corrupt software. So you're getting multiple gains, a synergistic gain from a very simple action. And for very small children who have not developed the ability to write, or just beginning or prior to, what I use is the speaking of affirmation. I mean, you're not going to ask a 3-year-old to write something 50 or 500 times, but you might have the child speak something. Now, and again, even with the reciting or writing of affirmation, again, it needs to be age specific and age appropriate. You wouldn't have, if you had a 12-year-old write something, an affirmation 500 times, you wouldn't have a 4-year-old write it 500 times, or a 6-year-old. So you need to use your powers of reasoning and rationale to make things appropriate. Now, when I said it's never appropriate to strike a child, to hit a child, there might be times when a child is violent where you actually have to physically constrain the child. That happens quite often. So that's different, though. But again, you have to always look at your motive. You have to look at your motive and your intention. Intention is 90% of creation, whereas action is 10%. So if you're restraining the child under the guise of wanting to punish or overpower or impress upon the child something that's by a form of duress or coercion, that's in some ways like striking a child. Using your physical power to impose yourself on a child is very abusive. But if your intention is pure, is just to stop the damage from happening, and you're using the least means necessary to achieve that, while you're holding a consciousness of love and compassion for this one's pain and this one's plight, that's going to be felt and perceived very, very differently by the child, even if no words are spoken, because they're feeling and receiving the consciousness you're in. Remember, the consciousness you are in when you create is what you create, not the doing, but the consciousness. So there is a very wide overview with some very specific dynamics, principles, and applications for dealing with errant and recalcitrant behavior in children. Hopefully that's been helpful to you.